Hi, so I'm Helen Dickinson, Senior Surveys Officer at the Bumblebee Conservation Trust, and I'm here today to talk to you about BeeWalk and also touch on the UK Pollinator Monitoring Scheme. So BeeWalk is the national monitoring scheme for bumblebee abundance across Britain. So it's based on the UK Butterfly Monitoring Scheme with tweaks to the protocol to account for the differences in the ecology and the way bumblebees move through the landscape and how that differs to butterflies. But if you're familiar with UK BMS, then lots about BeeWalk will be similar. So the aim of the scheme is to gather abundance and distribution data for Britain's bumblebees, to analyse that data and report on the trends in bumblebee populations. We're also able to look further into it and start to investigate these changes and their links between changes in climate and changes in land use and habitat as well, amongst other things that we can look into. So the scheme is a citizen science scheme, so we're very reliant on our amazing set of volunteers who go out and do the surveys and collect that data for us. So volunteers set up and walk a fixed monthly transect once a month from March to October inclusive. Transects are between 1 to 2 kilometres long and are split into multiple sections based on habitat. So during a survey, bumblebees are identified to species and caste where possible and counted along the different sections of that transect. The data is then submitted to the Trust via the BeeWalk website. So BeeWalk is the Trust's flagship project, our longest running project. So why did we set it up? Why is it so important to us that we have this and that we maintain it? So prior to BeeWalk, we did know a lot about long-term distribution of bumblebee species. From as early as 1900. So I'll go through this example here to explain what that information does tell us. So this is the distribution data for the great yellow bumblebee. So we can see here between 1900 and 1950 there were populations across England, Scotland and Wales. But if we move forward to data between 1950 and 2000, we can see that we've lost a lot of those populations across England and Wales. And if we move to 2000 to the present, it's actually disappeared completely from England and Wales and is now just hanging on the north coast of Scotland and on the islands as well, where it's associated with more traditionally managed maca wildflower grassland. So this is really useful information and gives us a clear picture sort of over time about where species are and where they are not, but it's not telling us anything about the numbers, the abundance. And it's from this long-term distribution data that the 1980s Atlas, Bumblebee Atlas, was produced. And it was this atlas that found that 7 species had declined by over 70% between 1900 and 1980s. So this information is really useful, but it's not giving us data at the timescale for us to be able to do something effectively about it, to act as that early warning system, which is what we wanted BeeWalk to be essentially. So the tricky thing at the time was that we didn't have a good pool of people available to go out and survey and collect that data for us. There was only really a handful of people able to confidently ID bumblebees, and within the trust we didn't have enough staff and resources to be able to go out and get that data ourselves. They're a group that can be tricky to ID, and it does take training to be able to do that. They're also tricky in terms of monitoring because of their behaviour. So they're central point foragers. So they're in and out of the nest as their central point, and they tend to fly in lanes. So if you're surveying and you're in that lane, you will see them. But if you're not in that lane, you won't. But that doesn't mean they're not there. They also have an annual life cycle. So there's fewer numbers at the start and end of the season, lots in the middle. They can be very affected by weather and habitat changes, so numbers do fluctuate widely. And as a result, we do need a lot of data to be able to pick up what's happening and to have some confidence in the patterns that we're seeing. So this is a map here of the UK Butterfly Monitoring Scheme transect spread, and this has always been the aspiration for BeeWalk, for us to be as established and have as good a coverage as UK BMS. So to do that, to get all that data, we need a lot of people. So who is going to actually go out and do that? So we essentially needed to create an army of bumblebee surveyors, and that is still in progress, and I think will forever be in progress, as the more people out surveying, the better. In addition, BeeWalk it's also much more than just a recording scheme. So we work with partners to train reserve managers, site staff, etc. And the BeeWalk protocol is used to monitor sites in partnership with the trust. So lots of RSPB sites, wildlife trust sites, some national trust sites do use the BeeWalk protocol to monitor their habitat creation, their meadow management. So as much as it's used for us to be able to get data to look at population trends, it's being used at sites as well to monitor the impact of habitat work in those areas. So for us, training is really key. So we want a set of bee walkers who feel confident in what they're doing and feel supported. So training is a core BeeWalk aim, and we aim to offer training at various levels from basic right through to advanced. A lot of these training courses are actually built into our on-the-ground projects, so are delivered in our project areas by our staff, so they're able to deliver in-person training to volunteers in their areas. We do also run online training as well, and online support sessions. So we think we've reached over 10,000 people in terms of training them in monitoring, which is fantastic, but we've still got lots of gaps. So from 2021 onwards, we developed our Skills for Bees projects, and the aim of these were projects that were solely focused on increasing recording of bumblebees in under-recorded areas. So having a staff member in that area whose role is to train and support people to get involved in surveying. And our most recent one is our Skills for Bees Scotland project, which is ongoing in the Cairngorms National Park. Again, this is great, and we would love to have these everywhere, but we're never going to quite have that reach. So we are looking at developing an online modular course for bee walkers, so something people can do when they first get involved, but then also go back to, say certain modules to refresh when they need to. So what's BeeWalk the story so far? So BeeWalk has been in progress for around 15 years or so. It started in 2008 for several years as part of a PhD project at Stirling University. It became a trust citizen science project from 2013 onwards. We can see from these graphs here, it's grown from strength to strength, essentially, by the COVID years. Unfortunately, I'm right in front of one of the bar charts, so apologies for that. The 2024 bars are a little bit lower because we're still receiving data through for that, so they will increase when we've got all the data in by the end of the year. So for 2023, we had data submitted for 964 transects, and over 49,000 records were submitted as well. So we're hopeful that for 2024 we may reach over 1,000 transects having data submitted for them. So that'll be a real milestone for us. And we did reach our millionth bee recorded through BeeWalk this year, earlier in June. So the map here shows the spread of our transects. So we do have quite good coverage, but we've got lots of gaps, lots of areas where we still need more people out surveying, particularly in Scotland. So just zooming in on the the area of interest for you guys. So the borders is very, very under-recorded, and it's likely bumblebees haven't been recorded in any shape or form in some of these areas. So we'd be really interested if people were keen to get involved and set up transects to fill in some of these gaps. It would be really, really helpful. So we've got all these fantastic volunteers going out surveying, sending us the data. So what's then happening to that data? So when we receive it in, we download it at various points throughout the year, and it goes through verification processes, and an analysis is performed annually in-house to produce population trends, and we publish that in our BeeWalk annual reports, of which all the past reports are available on the BeeWalk website. So we do what we can in-house, what we have the capacity to do, but we also want to share the data as widely as possible. So it's shared with the National Biodiversity Network Atlas, and we also upload the full dataset to Figshare, which is an online data sharing platform, and GBIF, which is the essentially the sort of global version of the NBN Atlas. So BeeWalk data is available for only for non-commercial use and can be shared with other relevant organisations. And it's used in collaboration with and externally by a large number of research institutions, NGOs, government agencies, record centres, for example. So it's been supplied to UKCEH, the Office for National Statistics, cited in over 50 scientific papers. For us, the wider the data is used, the greater the potential benefits for bumblebee conservation. So how are the bees actually doing? That's what the data is there to sort of keep us up to date with. So a bit of a caveat here is that this is just looking at data up to the end of August 2024. So we're still waiting for other data through. So this is our provisional findings for this year. So if we look at the graph here, the red dotted line is average number of bumblebees counted on Transx, and that's across 2010 through to 2023. So this gives us sort of the normal, the average way a year would look for bumblebees. So we have lower numbers as queens are coming out of hibernation. So numbers build slowly and then peak June, July, August in summertime, and then die back down again at the end of the season. So anything within the grey is variation that we would expect, that we've seen before. So this year, which is the blue line, we can see the early season was average or a little bit above average actually. So numbers of queens out of hibernation was quite good this year. Last year overall was a pretty good year for bumblebees, so we would expect to see a decent number of queens coming out. But then if we look at the data up to the end of August, it's not as good news. So numbers were down by around 22% compared to the long-term average. So numbers did improve come July, August, but we think lots of early nests failed around June time. So once a nest has failed, you can't come back from that. We're never going to get back up to those normal numbers. So when we look at it this way, it does sound like pretty bad news for our bumblebees. But we can actually break it down and look a little bit deeper and look at each month across the whole of BeeWalk. So here, each line is a different year with months across the bottom. So if we have a look here, so this time the red line is 2024, and we can see that yes, June was the worst June on record, but we have actually had worse Julys and worst Augusts. I think the key thing this year was that the bad weather happened in June, which is a critical time for nests, right in that early sort of establishment phase. So last year, which is the blue line, so that's 2023, we had a poor spring, but because the weather improved at the right time, that critical point for nests, things got better and nests did get going later in the summer. So ultimately, having this many years of data is incredibly helpful, and we can be hopeful that this year hasn't been complete doom and gloom for bumblebees. It's likely they will recover. It may just take some time. So we can then look at things on a species by species basis, which does show that despite overall numbers being down by 22%, some species did do okay this year. So Bombus journellus, our heath bumblebee, it actually did fine and is above the long-term average for the species. And a similar story for our early bumblebee. It did particularly well in May actually, and was able to survive that bad June. So it was, above average, and overall it actually had better numbers than seen in 2023 in the end. So some species didn't fare too badly at all. But unfortunately, that wasn't a case for a lot of our species. So this is Bombus vestalis, our southern cuckoo bumblebee. It had a good spring, it had a good number of queens coming out, but then it just didn't kind of kick on. The numbers stayed pretty low, and just dropped. So that was down by 32% from normal numbers. If we look at our tree bumblebee, Bombus hypnorum, so that was down by 41% compared to normal numbers. Again, it had a slightly above average spring actually, but really struggled in June. Tree bumblebees nest in quite exposed positions, so bird boxes, eaves and houses, so they'll have been particularly hit by that cold weather in June, and we can see that on the graph that they were doing okay, but sort of June hit and they started to decline. So it's likely that nests just couldn't cope with dealing with that cold period when they were in their vulnerable stage of just getting going. So some species had a pretty atrocious year when you actually look at the numbers. We saw a real drop in so the Bombus leucorum complex, our white-tailed bumblebee complex, where 3 species are grouped together because they're very difficult to split in the field. So this was seen at less than half the normal levels we would expect, and lower numbers of queens were recorded in spring. We normally see a big increase in June, but that cold weather just stopped that, and they weren't ever able to get going and recover. So our red-tailed bumblebee, Bombus lapidarius, was incredibly scarce this year, and it was at 28% of normal levels. So spring was actually normalish, but we think very few queens actually went on to establish nests, and as a result we were seeing very few workers and males and new queens. And normally this is the 3rd or 4th commonest species we see in BeeWalk, so it's by far the worst year we've seen for this species. So a really mixed bag. Some species have managed to survive and do okay, but lots have not fared so well. So I'll move on to the UK Pollinator Monitoring Scheme. So we're a partner in the scheme, which is coordinated by UK CEH, which was started in 2017. So the aim of the scheme is to look at how insect pollinator populations are changing across the UK. So looking at the abundance and distribution of flower visiting insects. So it's split into 2 different survey streams. So we've got the more entry-level scheme, which is a 10-minute flower insect time count, or you might know it as a fit count. So this can be done anywhere between April and September, and it can be done once, or you can do it multiple times in different locations. It's a really nice way to get started with pollinator monitoring, and in a way that is still collecting really valuable data. So you select from a list of, I think it's around 14 target plant species, and you choose a spot where there's a patch of one of these plant species, and you put down a 50 centimetre quadrat, and you sit there for 10 minutes and record the pollinators that are coming and visiting that square. And so for this, it's not identifying down to species level, it's just grouping into categories. So for example, there's you categorize it as a bumblebee or solitary bee, a hoverfly, a beetle, which again makes it a really accessible scheme for people who might not be far down the line of pollinator identification. So the more intensive way to be involved in POMs is the 1 kilometre square survey. So there's about 70 squares that have been identified across the UK, and these were identified via the National Plant Monitoring Scheme. So this map shows here, so blue squares are ones that have been adopted by a volunteer, reds are ones that are available to be adopted, so there might be a couple of interest here. But if there's not one available near you, do keep checking back in if it's something you're keen on, because sometimes squares do become available if a volunteer moves on, for example. So this involves 4 site visits, one in May, June, July and August. You're essentially spending the day there setting out pan traps. So these are it's a way of surveying for flying insects, with bowls put out to essentially catch and collect insects. So you're putting those in place and you're staying on the site. They're in place for 6 hours, and you're doing fit counts whilst you're there as well. And then you collect the samples, send them back to CEH where they're identified as species and added into the analysis. So it is quite intensive, but there'll always be somebody who comes out with you on your first surveys just to make sure you know what's going on. So if you do have that extra level of time, it's a really fantastic way to get involved in the scheme. So as I said, the scheme only started in 2017, so it's still fairly young, but this is looking at the number of fit counts that have been submitted, and it's increasing year on year, so it's great to see that people are getting involved. And these are some of the main stats from 2023. So 291 1 kilometre squares sites were surveyed, and 69 of those were in Scotland. 4,340 fit counts were submitted, and of that 405 were from Scotland, so I think there's still a way to go, and loads of scope for Scotland to be adding a lot more data. So the scheme, as it is still in quite the early stages, it's relatively early in terms of what the data is able to tell us confidently about trends. But the aim is to develop analytical approaches and metrics which can be used as indicators to inform conservation action and to be able to set priorities. So whilst it's still in that sort of early stages of getting enough data to be able to do that, it is still being used and is able to impact policy and research agendas, for example. So here's a map of the fit counts where they've been submitted from. And so we can see here that, again, there's lots of gaps, particularly in the borders. So lots of scope to, make a real difference in terms of, generating pollinator data in areas where we may not have had anything previously. So if we've inspired you to get involved in pollinator monitoring, that would be amazing, and a big thank you to anyone who is here who is already involved. We couldn't do any of this without our volunteers. But if you'd like to find out more for BeeWalk, if you head to beewalk.org.uk, or you can email myself at beewalk@bumblebeeconservation.org. I'm able to, let you know if there's any transects nearby that need taking on. We do have available transects if a volunteer has moved, for example, or we can help support you to set up your own transect from scratch. If you're keen to get involved in POMS, if you go to ukpoms.org.uk, you'll find loads of resources and information there. Thank you very much.